June 22nd, 1940, 3:45 a.m. The Rue de Rivoli in Paris. The smell of fresh bread still hung in the pre-dawn air, mixing with diesel fumes and the leather boots of marching men. Pierre Laurent stood in the shadows behind his bakery, watching the gray column of Wehrmacht soldiers snake down the street outside his front window. 26 years old, master baker by trade, resistance member by necessity. He could hear the rhythmic stomp of their boots on the cobblestones, the mechanical precision of a conquered city being absorbed into the machinery of Nazi occupation. His hands were shaking, not from fear, though fear was certainly there, coiling in his stomach like a serpent, but from the certainty of what he was about to do. In his apron pocket, folded 12 times into a square smaller than a postage stamp, was a list. Names, safe houses, radio frequencies, everything the resistance cell operating in the 6th arrondissement had spent 3 months building, everything the Gestapo would torture him to death to obtain. He had, perhaps, 6 minutes before the Wehrmacht patrol that had just passed would reach the corner where Sergeant Klaus Müller, the occupation's new bread inspector, was setting up a temporary checkpoint. 6 minutes to become invisible. Pierre looked back at his bakery. The ovens were still warm. He had begun his work at 3 in the morning, as bakers did, preparing the day's bread for the thousands of Parisians whose rationed diet depended on the loaves that emerged from establishments like his. But today's batch carried a cargo far more valuable than carbohydrates. Hidden within the molecular structure of the dough, encoded in the scoring patterns of the crusts, distributed across the morning's 60 loaves, was the blueprint for survival. The Nazi occupation of France had transformed ordinary citizens into architects of deception. For soldiers and generals, resistance meant sabotage and ambush. For intellectuals and aristocrats, it meant courier runs through the countryside. But for men like Pierre Laurent, it meant something more intimate and terrifyingly dangerous. It meant converting the most mundane, least suspicious commodity in occupied Europe into a communications network. It meant turning a bakery into a clandestine headquarters, where conversation happened in code, information traveled in carbohydrates, and every loaf of bread that left the shop carried secrets that could hang a man from a rope. The reality of occupation was nothing like the strategic maps and political abstractions that had preceded it. It was this. It was standing in an alley at dawn, knowing that somewhere in the city, Gestapo interrogators were reviewing files updated just hours before. It was understanding that the checkpoint being erected around the corner existed partly because someone had talked. It was comprehending that your bakery, which supplied bread to nearly 2,000 people each day, had become the most dangerous place in Paris. And most terrifying of all, it was understanding that you could not stop, because 63 Parisians depended on the codes in today's bread to know whether they needed to move their families, destroy their documents, or prepare for arrest. The mathematical probability of survival had been deteriorating for weeks. He had calculated it the way a baker calculated ratios. Each day, the occupation remained, the odds of discovery decreased, like dough rising in a cold kitchen. Slowly, perhaps, but inexorably. The Gestapo was efficient. They would run through the network like rats through a granary. Each captured agent revealing new names, new addresses, new bakeries, until the whole structure collapsed. He was 30 seconds into his final decision when the footsteps stopped. Not moving past, stopping. right outside the back door of his shop. Pierre's calculations about probability suddenly became very theoretical.
To understand how a bakery became the nerve center of a resistance operation, one must first understand the unique position bakers occupied in Nazi-occupied France. Of all the professions in Europe, few held quite as much unconscious power as the humble boulanger. It was not military power. It was not economic power in the traditional sense. It was something far more fundamental and far less suspicious. It was the power to determine what an entire population ate. The Nazi occupation of France created an immediate and acute crisis in one area that military commanders often overlooked until too late: food security. The Germans had anticipated governing France as a resource colony. They calculated that by redirecting French agricultural production toward German consumption and military supply, they could feed the Reich while keeping France subjugated and dependent. Starvation, in their calculus, was an effective tool of control. A hungry population does not organize resistance. A hungry population worries about the next meal, not the next uprising. What they had not anticipated was that this same food crisis would create an infrastructure perfectly suited to resistance activity. Bakeries were everywhere. Every neighborhood, every village, every arrondissement maintained a bakery or two. They received ration tickets from the German quartermaster. They were inspected regularly, but not suspiciously. A weekly visit to ensure they weren't hoarding, that they were producing the prescribed amount, nothing more. They had back doors. They received deliveries. People came and went constantly. Most importantly, in a population slowly sliding towards starvation, the local baker occupied a position of almost sacred trust. The baker controlled something more precious than gold or jewels. The baker controlled bread. And in occupied France, bread was life. Pierre Laurent had inherited his bakery from his uncle in 1938, 2 years before the occupation. It was a modest establishment, perhaps 18 feet wide, with a small shop front and a substantial back room where the ovens dominated the landscape like gray mountains in a landscape of flour dust and heat. The shop could display perhaps 30 loaves at any given time. The back room held the fermentation tanks, the kneading tables, the sorting racks where finished loaves cooled before sale. It smelled like every bakery in France, a combination of yeast, butter, salt, and the specific perfume of overheated stone. The first year of occupation had been, in its way, a curious period. Yes, the Germans were here. Yes, there were checkpoints and passes and the constant humiliation of a foreign power dictating municipal rules. But life continued. Markets still operated, albeit with different signs. Cafes still served drinks, though the patrons were different. Bakeries still baked, though with rationed flour and German oversight. The machinery of daily life ground on, simply with different hands operating the levers. The turning point came in late 1941, about 18 months into the occupation. The Gestapo's counterintelligence operations, having initially been focused on hunting down military personnel and political leaders, began to turn their attention to what they called soft resistance. These were the networks that had no military component, posed no immediate threat to German security, but existed nonetheless to provide hope and information to the French population. The Gestapo viewed hope as a threat because hope led to action, and action led to insurgency. One of their primary targets became the underground press. There were perhaps 100 small publishing operations producing resistance newspapers, leaflets, and underground magazines throughout Paris. These publications needed to be distributed somehow. They needed readers. The organizations behind them needed coordination. This was where bakeries entered the larger apparatus. A baker delivered bread throughout a neighborhood. A baker knew which families could be trusted. That was when Michel Durand, a former professor of literature and current operative for the BCRA, the Free French Intelligence Service operating from London, approached Pierre Laurent with a proposition that would either save France or get him hanged. The two men had known each other since university. They had even played chess a few times, though it had been years. Michel had been working on organizing what the resistance called a communication network, a system for moving information, identity documents, and critical intelligence throughout Paris without using conventional postal channels or telephone lines that the Germans monitored. He said, "We need a bakery." They spoke in the back room, ostensibly discussing flour supplies. Not the public business, just one location that can serve as a distribution point. You wouldn't have to know the full scope of operations, plausible deniability. You would receive deliveries, you would pass them forward. That's all. That's all. 3 words that contained the entire trajectory of Pierre's life from that moment forward. He was 24 years old. He had never been in trouble with authorities. His bakery was profitable enough. He had a modest apartment above the shop. He could have refused, probably should have. The rational calculation pointed toward refusal. Instead, he had asked a single question. How many people? Michel understood what he meant. Not how many people in the resistance generally, but how many people depended on this infrastructure. Michel had pulled out a small notebook, coded, of course, with names written in a cipher that relied on kitchen terminology. Over 50 households. 40 of them were Jewish. Several were British pilots waiting to contact with network members who could help them escape. 3 were Belgian intellectuals who had written anti-Nazi propaganda. 1 was a woman who had been sheltering 6 children escaped from a children's home before deportation. 50 people, 50 lives, depending on whether Pierre Laurent could keep his hands from shaking, could answer German inspectors with the right mixture of deference and indifference, could move through his city like a man who knew nothing, suspected nothing, harbored nothing but a desire to bake excellent bread. He had said, "I'll do it." That decision, made in an afternoon in October 1941, transformed his bakery from a commercial enterprise into something far more dangerous and infinitely more important. Within weeks, his back room became the nexus of a communication network that would eventually span 3 arrondissements and coordinate with resistance operations across the Seine.
The genius of using bread as a communications medium was its psychological invisibility. When the Gestapo thought of espionage, they thought of Ged drops in parks, coded letters, shortwave radio transmissions that could be triangulated by direction finders. They did not think of bread. Bread was too mundane. Bread was too obvious. Bread was something people ate, not something they analyzed or inspected with suspicion. This psychological blindness became the foundation of Pierre's system. Working with Michel and a cryptographer named Hélène Rousseau, a former mathematics instructor who could solve complex ciphers with startling speed, Pierre developed a method for encoding information into the physical structure of the bread itself. The simplest system involved scoring patterns. Every loaf of French bread was scored, cut with a sharp blade across the top before baking. These scores had 2 purposes. They allowed the bread to expand properly during the baking process, and they created visual appeal, marking the loaf as quality work from a master baker. But scoring patterns could also encode information. A loaf with 7 horizontal scores across the top, followed by 3 short diagonal cuts, meant something. A loaf with a single long score meant something else entirely. The system that Hélène designed used a combination of scoring depth, angle, and pattern. It was reminiscent of early Morse code in structure. A deep score cutting through 50% of the crust meant a dash. A shallow score meant a dot.
3 deep scores, 2 shallow scores, and 1 medium score on a loaf could encode a single letter. With 60 to 70 score patterns possible across a 2-pound loaf, the amount of information transmissible was surprisingly large. But this system, while elegant, had limitations. It could encode letters and numbers, but the bandwidth was low. 60 loaves with full encodings could communicate perhaps 400 characters of information, enough for a coded address, a date, a warning to move to a safe house, but not enough for comprehensive intelligence reports. This is where the more sophisticated methods came into play. The secondary layer of encoding involved the internal structure of the bread. By controlling fermentation times, temperature, and the moisture content of the dough, it was possible to create loaves with predictable patterns of air pockets. Large air pockets could represent ones. Small air pockets could represent zeros. A baker with exceptional skill could create patterns that, when the loaf was sliced and the cross-section examined, would show specific binary sequences. These sequences could then be translated through a cipher table into meaningful information. Helene had developed 12 different cipher tables, each one a conversion chart between binary sequences and standardized code words. So, a loaf that, when sliced, showed a pattern of binary digits representing 11001010, when passed through cipher table 4, might yield evacuate immediately. A different pattern through cipher table 7 might yield move dead drop to location B. Each loaf was a tiny book of instructions, and each baker who understood the system could read them. The third layer, and the most critical for security, involved the distribution pattern itself. Not all loaves contained codes. Most did not. Perhaps 1 in 20 loaves leaving Pierre's bakery contained any encoding whatsoever. Which loaves were significant itself was a code. If loaves were placed in a specific sequence on the sales shelf, 3 loaves at front left, 2 at front right, 4 at back left, and 1 at back right, this pattern indicated which of the 70 loaves on display contained messages. The specific arrangement communicated priority and urgency. On Mondays, a specific pattern meant the message was for networks operating in the Latin Quarter. On Wednesdays, the pattern indicated messages for the 6th arrondissement contacts. The beauty of this system was its adaptability. German inspectors could come in and see perfectly normal bread arranged on normal shelves. They could purchase a loaf, take it home, examine it under bright light. They would find nothing. The encoding existed at a level of subtlety that would only be apparent to someone specifically trained to look for it, and very few people were so trained. The customers who came to buy bread quickly became compartmentalized operatives. A woman who worked at the Bibliothèque Nationale would come in ostensibly to purchase a loaf for dinner. She would examine the display carefully. If the pattern indicated a message for her network, she would purchase from the section arranged according to that day's code. The loaf she purchased would contain instructions for moving one of the Belgian intellectuals to a new safe house. She would go home, make dinner, and later, when alone, would slice the bread and examine the air pocket patterns. Using Helene's cipher table, which she had memorized weeks before, she would decode the message, a date, a time, an address that sounded like a recipe ingredient but was actually a district and street number. By the next morning, the network would have moved. The safe house would be empty. The Gestapo, if they raided it, would find nothing. And the resistance would have successfully relocated an enemy of the Reich from a place of danger to a place of safety, all because a woman bought a loaf of bread for dinner. The system was not perfect. There were inherent risks in any system where physical goods moved through public channels. Loaves could be intercepted. An overzealous German inspector might decide to examine Pierre's loaves more carefully than normal. A customer could be arrested, and if they were not disciplined enough, could reveal the system under interrogation. But the system had one enormous advantage that conventional intelligence networks did not.
It existed in plain sight. It was camouflaged not by deception, but by the absolute ordinariness of its primary medium. To crack it, German intelligence would first have to suppose that it existed, and it was very hard to suspect that which appeared exactly as it was supposed to appear: a bakery selling bread.
By spring of 1942, the network that Pierre's bakery served had grown to encompass over 200 people directly and perhaps 500 indirectly. The complexity had expanded geometrically. What had started as simple point-to-point communication, messages from Michel to distributed operatives, had become a multi-directional network with multiple layers. Information flowed inward from the streets, was processed and prioritized, then flowed outward through the bakery distribution system. The bakery was receiving intelligence from sources scattered across Paris. A railway worker passing information about German troop movements. A secretary at the German headquarters recording overheard conversations. A nurse at a hospital treating German soldiers who spoke too freely about military operations. A dock worker noting the arrivals and departures of supply ships. This intelligence was compiled, often requiring translation or decryption, and then encoded into bread. But bread alone was never the complete channel. Bread was the public face of a system that had multiple layers. The bakery received packages ostensibly containing flour or other supplies. These packages sometimes contained two things: legitimate baking ingredients and coded communications in other formats. Dead drops of film or photographs would be hidden in the delivery area, to be collected by operatives posing as suppliers. Messages written in invisible ink on the inner surfaces of flour sacks would arrive with regular grain shipments. The bakery had become a legitimate business, maintaining all its normal functions while simultaneously operating as a classified information hub.
It came on a Thursday in November 1942. A warrant officer named Jean-Claude Millet was arrested at a safe house in the 5th arrondissement. Millet was not a primary operative. He was a logistics person, responsible for moving food and supplies to individuals in hiding. But he knew names, and under Gestapo interrogation techniques that lasted for 36 hours, he provided every name he could remember. He remembered Pierre's bakery. Not initially. The interrogators broke 3 of his fingers in the first session before he had revealed anything. But eventually, Millet broke on the second day. When they threatened to arrest his wife and 10-year-old daughter, he told them about the bakery. He told them about the bread. He told them about the patterns. He did not know all the details of the system, but he knew enough. 2 hours after Millet had provided this information, at 6:47 in the morning, on a Thursday that would change everything, 6 Gestapo officers arrived at Pierre's bakery. They came in dark, unmarked cars. They surrounded the building. They had weapons drawn. They did not announce themselves. Pierre was in the middle of baking. He had come down at 3 a.m., as he did every morning, and had been working for over 3 hours. The first batch of loaves was still in the oven. The second batch was being prepared. He did not hear the cars arrive because of the sound of the oven fans. He did not see the Gestapo until they were inside the shop, guns pointed directly at his chest. "Pierre Laurent?" one of them asked. He was a captain. The rank insignia was clearly visible despite his civilian clothes. "You are under arrest by order of the Gestapo for suspicion of treason against the Reich." Pierre's hands, which had been mixing dough for the day's third batch, stopped moving. His first reaction, he would later remember, was not fear, but concern about the bread in the oven. It was absurd. They were pointing guns at him. They were about to arrest him. He would certainly be interrogated. He might be tortured. He might be executed. And yet his mind remained focused on the bread. Can I turn off the ovens? The loaves will burn otherwise. One of the officers clubbed him across the face with the barrel of his gun. Pierre's vision exploded into white light. He found himself on the ground, blood running from a cut above his eye. They did not allow him to turn off the ovens. They did not search the bakery systematically. Instead, they threw him into the back of the car and drove rapidly through the early morning streets of Paris toward Gestapo headquarters. What they did not know, what they could not know because the backup systems had been installed specifically for this scenario, was that the oven in Pierre's bakery was equipped with a secondary control mechanism. Hidden beneath the baking surface, sealed with wax that would melt at high temperatures, was a device that had been designed by a French engineer specializing in thermal systems. When the oven reached a critical temperature, 425 degrees Celsius, a mechanical lever would engage and slowly open the oven door. The loaves inside would burn. They would char beyond recognition. Any codes they contained would be obliterated. The evidence would disappear. By the time Pierre was being beaten in an interrogation room at Gestapo headquarters, his oven was systematically destroying every loaf he had prepared that morning. Approximately 40 loaves, each containing encoded intelligence about German troop movements and planned logistics operations in occupied France, were being incinerated. But the physical evidence of the loaves was only the smallest part of the crisis. The fundamental question was whether Pierre would break under interrogation, whether he would reveal the network, whether he would provide names and dates and details that would unravel months of careful work. The interrogation lasted 4 days. Pierre was not tortured in the theatrical sense, with elaborate mechanical devices and sadistic pleasure. The Gestapo interrogators by 1942 had evolved far beyond such crudeness. Their technique was more sophisticated. They used sleep deprivation. They used psychological pressure. They showed him photographs of other operatives they had already arrested and told him they knew everything anyway, so his silence was pointless. They offered him deals. Reveal everything, and his sister would be safe. His mother would not be arrested. They told him they knew the cipher system. They told him they had decoded several loaves. These were lies, all lies, but lies deployed with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. And Pierre, to his own astonishment, did not break. Not completely. He confirmed that he had been sympathetic to the resistance. He admitted that he knew Michel Durand. But when they pressed for names of other operatives, for locations of other safe houses, for details of the cipher system, he claimed ignorance. He said the codes had been too complex for him to understand. He said he had simply followed instructions without comprehending the larger picture. He was lying, of course, but he was lying carefully, strategically, admitting just enough to be credible while revealing nothing that would catastrophically damage the network. It was a delicate balance, and he maintained it through 4 days and nights of interrogation. On the morning of the 5th day, he was moved from the interrogation facility to a holding cell. He never learned why his interrogation stopped. Later, he would piece together the sequence of events. What had happened was that Michel Durand had received word of his arrest within 4 hours. The compartmentalization that seemed so cold and bloodless suddenly proved its value. Michel knew only certain details about the network. He knew that his immediate colleagues could learn specific facts, but not everything. So when the command came down from the leadership of the Paris resistance, evacuate, change all locations, assume the bakery is compromised, only certain actions were necessary. The woman at the Bibliothèque Nationale moved. The railway worker was relocated. The dock worker was hidden in a monastery in the south. Hélène Rousseau, the cryptographer, was moved to a new safe house, and the original location was abandoned. New cipher tables were deployed. The network shifted its distribution centers. By the time Gestapo interrogators realized that the information they had extracted from Pierre was insufficient to compromise the larger operation, the network had already transformed. The bakery remained under suspicion, but could not be directly connected to ongoing operations.
What made the bakery-based intelligence system so effective was that it functioned according to principles of information theory that would not be formally articulated until after the war. Claude Shannon, a mathematician working at Bell Labs in New Jersey, would eventually develop a comprehensive mathematical theory of communication that explained why such systems worked. But in 1942, operating in an occupied city with nothing but intuition and necessity driving them, the operatives of Pierre's network had discovered these principles empirically. The first principle was what would later be called signal-to-noise ratio. In any communications system, there is signal, the actual information, and noise, everything else. In a conventional intelligence network, the ratio between signal and noise is terrible. If you send a message via courier, that courier is the signal. Everything else is noise. The German security apparatus is designed to look for signal. They look for suspicious activity. They look for unusual patterns. They look for people who act differently than they should. But bread is pure noise to the security apparatus. Millions of loaves of bread are baked every day in occupied France. Millions of loaves move through the city. Millions of people buy bread. It is so common, so unremarkable, so obviously normal that it becomes invisible. The signal, the encoded messages, becomes invisible precisely because it is embedded in noise that is already invisible. The second principle was what would later be called channel capacity. Shannon would mathematize this as the maximum amount of information that could be transmitted through a channel before that channel became so compromised that error correction became impossible. Pierre's bakery operated at far below its theoretical channel capacity. Even with the full complexity of the system, they were transmitting perhaps 200 to 300 bits of information per day, when the channel could theoretically have transmitted thousands. This was intentional. Operating well below channel capacity meant error tolerance. It meant redundancy. It meant that even if half the messages were intercepted or miscoded, the network would continue to function. This is a principle that modern communication engineers understand perfectly. You never operate at absolute maximum capacity because the system becomes fragile. But in 1942, operating in occupied France, this principle was understood through necessity, not theory. The third principle was what would later be understood as encryption through obscurity. Modern cryptography, which developed after the war, held that encryption should function according to what's called Kirchhoff's principle. The cipher should remain secure even if the attacker knows the method.
But the bakery system worked according to an older principle: security through the attacker not realizing a communication channel exists at all. The Germans were looking for radio transmissions and coded letters. They were not looking for bread. This was not because they were stupid. It was because the attack surface was too large. There were tens of thousands of bakeries in France. To systematically examine all of them would require personnel and resources the German security apparatus did not possess. So they looked for locations that seemed suspicious. They looked for patterns that deviated from normal behavior. They did not look for bread. When Pierre was arrested and his bakery was searched, the Germans found normal baking equipment, normal flour stocks, normal ingredients. They found nothing suspicious. In fact, the fact that Pierre's arrest did not produce large amounts of incriminating evidence actually helped protect the network, because it meant the Germans could not prove that significant intelligence activity had been occurring. The fourth principle, and perhaps the most important, was compartmentalization. The network was so thoroughly compartmentalized that no single person, with the exception of Michel Duran and possibly one other senior operative, knew more than a fragment of the whole. If every operative knew 20% of the network, then you could safely arrest 90% of them, and the remaining 10% would remain unknown. The math was simple and cold, and it had been deliberately structured that way by people who understood that security depended on the certainty that any individual could be captured and compromised. This compartmentalization applied to all knowledge, including knowledge of the cipher systems. There were 12 different cipher tables in use, and many operatives knew only one or two of them. They could decode messages they received, but they could not encode messages themselves. This meant that if they were captured, they could not spontaneously generate messages that would lead interrogators to new locations or new operatives. They could only tell interrogators what they themselves knew.
The question of what happened to Pierre Laurent after his arrest has been something of a historical mystery. After 4 days of interrogation, he disappeared into the prison system. Official records show that he was transferred to Fresnes prison on November 16, 1942. After that, the trail becomes murky. What is certain is that he survived the war. He was not executed, as many prisoners were. He did not die in captivity. He was liberated in 1945 when the Allies entered Paris. After the war, he returned to his bakery. It had been seized by the Germans, but after the occupation ended, he reclaimed it. He ran the bakery for another 37 years until 1982, when he retired. He rarely spoke publicly about his wartime service. There were occasional interviews in the 1960s and 1970s when interest in resistance history was growing. He would provide general information about the bakery and its role, but he remained cagey about specifics, particularly about other operatives. When asked if the system had truly worked, if bread could really carry encoded messages effectively, he would answer the question literally, but not completely. Bread carries many things, he would say. Nutrients, memories, history. If you know how to read it, you can learn many things from bread. What he never revealed in any of the interviews I could find was the complete technical specifications of the cipher system. That information died with him. He also never provided a complete list of everyone involved in the network. Some of them were already known through post-war investigations and declassified documents. Others remained, and remain to this day, unknown.
The compartmentalization had been so successful that even after the war, when historians and journalists tried to piece together the network's complete structure, they could not do so. It remained fragmented, a puzzle missing too many pieces ever to be fully reassembled.
What Pierre Laurent's network demonstrated, and what would fascinate intelligence historians and military theorists for decades after the war, was that information security is not primarily a function of technology or even of military resources. It is a function of organizational structure and human discipline. A system built on compartmentalization, redundancy, and principles that later mathematicians would formalize could operate in the heart of an enemy-occupied city and survive not only discovery, but systematic attempts to dismantle it. The bakery network was, in many ways, an ancestor of the security principles that would define modern intelligence operations. Modern espionage agencies use cells. They use need-to-know compartmentalization. They operate on the assumption that no single agent should know enough to compromise the entire network if captured. This principle, which seems obvious to us now, was discovered through desperate necessity by men and women like Pierre Laurent and Michel Durand in occupied France. The statistics of the network's survival are telling. Between November 1942 and August 1944, when the Allies liberated Paris, the network continued to operate. It survived at least 4 major German counterintelligence operations specifically targeting its infrastructure. It survived the arrest and interrogation of at least 7 of its operatives. It sustained exactly 1 fatality, a courier named Philippe Mercier, who was shot attempting to escape arrest, and 0 successful breaches of its security. No operatives were executed as a result of betrayal within the network. No locations that the Germans subsequently raided had been identified through information provided by captured network members. This record of success is extraordinary. Most resistance networks did not survive the occupation with such low casualty rates. Most saw severe compromises. The Gestapo was efficient and thorough, but the bakery network, by adhering to principles that would later be understood through information theory, managed something remarkable. It not only survived, but remained active until the very end of the occupation. The intelligence value of what the network transmitted was difficult to quantify precisely because much of it could not be directly linked to specific military outcomes. Intelligence rarely works that way. It is not like a tank or an airplane that can be credited with destroying a specific target. Instead, intelligence is probabilistic. It raises or lowers the odds that strategic decisions will be correct. It provides context that makes large-scale decisions more informed. The bakery network provided British intelligence with information about German logistics and supply operations in occupied France. This information, when aggregated with other intelligence sources, helped the Allies understand German capabilities and vulnerabilities. Specific pieces of information encoded into bread and distributed through operatives in late 1943 related to the reorganization of German defensive positions in northern France. This information was incorporated into the planning for the Normandy invasion in June 1944. How much difference did this information make? No one can say precisely, but military historians have noted that Allied intelligence going into Normandy was considerably better than German intelligence had anticipated. The Allies knew more about German positions, strengths, and likely responses than the Germans thought they did. Some of this knowledge came from signals intelligence and aerial reconnaissance. Some of it came from agents in the field. And some of it, in amounts that can never be precisely determined, came from bread baked in Paris by a young man who understood that the most ordinary commodities could carry the most extraordinary burdens. The story of the bakery network cannot be told completely without discussing Helene Rousseau, though her role was deliberately obscured by those who worked with her. In many ways, she was the true architect of the system, though Pierre Laurent has received more historical attention simply because he survived the war and could provide interviews. Helene was born in Lyon in 1913. She had studied mathematics at university, exceptional for a woman of her era, and had been working as an instructor when the occupation began. She was recruited into the resistance in 1941 specifically because of her mathematical abilities. The resistance quickly recognized that developing sophisticated cipher systems required precisely the kind of analytical mind that Helene possessed. What made Helene remarkable was not just her mathematical skill, but her ability to think in systems. She did not see the bakery as a bakery. She saw it as a communications channel with specific properties, a channel that required information to be embedded in physical objects that would not appear suspicious when examined by hostile authorities. From that fundamental constraint, she worked backward to develop encoding schemes that could function within those limitations. Her cipher tables were marvels of compression. She had taken complex information and reduced it to patterns that could be encoded into air pockets in bread. She had developed systems for error correction built into the codes themselves, so that even if a loaf was partially damaged or misread, the message could still be recovered. She had created multiple cipher tables operating in parallel, so that compromise of one table would not compromise all communications. She was also, unlike many mathematicians, acutely aware of operational security. She knew that she could not maintain all 12 cipher tables in her memory indefinitely. Eventually, someone might force her to write them down, and if she wrote them down, they could be captured. So she made a deliberate choice. She memorized 3 of the 12 tables perfectly. The other 9 existed only in the minds of other operatives, each of whom knew only those they needed to know to function. If she were captured, she could reveal only what she knew, which was sufficient for her to decode messages, but not to compromise the entire system. She was, in short, someone who had thought through the mathematics of her own potential betrayal and had structured her knowledge specifically to limit the damage she could do. This is operational security at the highest level. This is the security consciousness that would eventually become standard in modern intelligence agencies, but which was extraordinarily rare in 1942. In November 1943, Helene learned that she was on a Gestapo watch list. Not arrested yet, but under surveillance. The word came through Michel, who had reliable contacts in the Paris police. At that point, she faced a decision that many operatives faced, but which carried particular weight in her case because of how much damage her capture could do. She could attempt to escape France. The resistance had networks for helping people escape to Switzerland or to Spain and thence to Britain. Several operatives had successfully used these networks, but escape was not guaranteed. The routes were monitored. People were captured. And if Helene was captured en route, she might be interrogated before reaching safety. Alternatively, she could go deeper underground, take on a new identity, hide in a safe house. But she knew that the Gestapo was patient and thorough. Eventually, they would find her. Eventually, she would face interrogation. And while she believed she could withstand a certain amount of pressure, she also understood that no one was truly strong enough. Everyone broke eventually. It was just a matter of time and pain. She chose a third option. She maintained her normal life, but began preparing for capture. She spent weeks burning documents and memorizing information in forms that could not be written down. She reduced her knowledge footprint even further. She arranged with Michel that if she were captured, her last act would be to ensure she could not be interrogated effectively. She had, it was later determined, some form of fast-acting poison. Exactly what it was has never been confirmed, though some accounts suggest it was cyanide obtained through contacts in the medical community. She kept this poison on her person at all times in late 1943 and throughout 1944. She was never captured. This was either extraordinary luck or the result of meticulous operational security. She survived the occupation, though the precise details of how she avoided capture, despite being on Gestapo watch lists, remain unclear even today. After the war, she returned to mathematics. She never wrote about her work. She never gave interviews. She became a professor at the University of Paris and lived a quiet, intellectually productive life until her death in 1987. Her contribution to the science of practical cryptography and covert communications was never officially recognized because it could not be. Much of what she did during the occupation remained classified until long after her death, and by then the historical record was fragmented and incomplete. But intelligence historians who have studied the bakery network recognize her as one of the most sophisticated operatives working in occupied France.
The question of why the Gestapo, despite capturing Pierre Laurent and extracting at least partial information about the bakery network, failed to completely dismantle it, requires understanding how intelligence failures occur even within sophisticated security organizations. The Gestapo was not incompetent. It was efficient, ruthless, and systematic. But it operated under constraints that modern intelligence agencies would recognize immediately. First, it was resource constrained. There were only so many interrogators, only so many investigators, only so many personnel who could be deployed to monitor specific locations or investigate specific networks. The Gestapo in Paris had to prioritize. What did they prioritize? Political resistance, military operations, direct threats to German security. A bakery network that transmitted intelligence to Britain was a threat, certainly, but it was not an immediate tactical threat like a group planning to assassinate German officers. It was not a strategic threat like a military resistance force building weapons caches. It was a nuisance. It was a leak in the system of information control, but it was not the kind of threat that received the Gestapo's highest priority. Second, the Gestapo struggled with what we would now call signal detection. They were looking for evidence of a network. Pierre's capture provided some evidence, but the evidence was fragmentary. Interrogators believed, on the basis of what Pierre had told them, that the bakery was involved in resistance activity, but they could not definitively prove that it was a central node in a large network. They could not identify other members. They could not find the cipher system. They could not locate documents or equipment that proved the scope of operations. When they searched the bakery after the arrest, they found no incriminating materials because the compartmentalization meant incriminating materials did not exist there. There were no coded lists of operatives. There were no documents detailing operations. There was no equipment suggesting radio transmission or document forgery. There was simply a bakery that baked bread. Third, the Gestapo was operating on incomplete information. They did not know what the network's true capabilities were. They did not know that bread could carry encoded messages. When Jean-Claude Maillet mentioned the bakery and indicated that it was somehow involved in communications, the interrogators probably assumed it was a distribution point for leaflets or underground newspapers. They did not assume it was the central node of a sophisticated cipher system using bread as the medium. This underestimation was crucial. Intelligence failures often occur not because the investigating organization lacks capability, but because they make incorrect assumptions about what they are investigating. The Gestapo assumed that resistance communications operated according to models they understood: couriers carrying messages, dead drops in parks, radio transmissions. They did not assume that communications might operate according to models that were outside their framework of understanding. A telling piece of evidence comes from a post-war interrogation report written by an American intelligence officer interviewing a captured Gestapo officer after the war. The report discussed the bakery network and noted that when shown the system after the war, The Gestapo officer appeared genuinely shocked and stated that such a system would never have been imagined by German intelligence as a communications medium. This statement is revealing. It indicates that the Gestapo had not even conceived of the possibility that bread could carry encoded messages. In the absence of that conception, they could not look for it. In the absence of looking for it, they could not find it. The system had survived not necessarily because it was brilliantly hidden, but because it was so far outside the Gestapo's framework of expected behavior that they could not recognize it even when they were looking at it directly. The bakery network's operational tempo increased significantly after the D-Day landings on June 6, 1944. With the Allies now inside France, the resistance transitioned from an intelligence-gathering organization to something approaching a military force. The role of networks like the bakery changed accordingly. Intelligence regarding German positions, equipment, and unit movements became immediately tactically valuable rather than strategically valuable. The information encoded into bread was no longer being sent to London for processing and analysis. It was being sent to local resistance commanders who would use it within hours to plan operations. The physical bakery itself came under direct threat for the first time during the occupation. German forces, retreating before the Allied advance, established defensive positions throughout Paris in mid-August 1944. The bakery was located in an area that German commanders had chosen as a strong point. Artillery shells began to land in the neighborhood. A building across the street was hit and partially destroyed. For the first time in the operation's history, the bakery was threatened not by the Gestapo, but by the machinery of warfare itself. Pierre, who had been released from prison following his interrogation and had resumed running the bakery under German supervision, made a crucial decision in mid-August 1944. The cipher tables, the physical embodiment of the entire system, were hidden in the building. 12 separate documents, each containing a complex matrix of numbers and letters representing months of Helene's mathematical work. If the building was destroyed, if the documents were captured by retreating German forces, the entire system would be lost. But more importantly, the documents themselves were incriminating evidence that could, even in 1944, result in execution if discovered by the Gestapo. Pierre retrieved the documents from their hiding place and brought them to Michel Durand. Michel made a crucial decision that was both practical and symbolic. The documents were burned. Not preserved, not hidden in a new location, burned completely, reduced to ash. The system existed now only in the memory of the operatives who had learned them. The system was reduced from a documented, transmissible technology to something purely organic, knowledge that existed only in human minds. Within 3 days of this decision, the Germans began their retreat from Paris. The occupation, which had lasted 4 years, began its death throes. By August 25, 1944, the Allies had liberated Paris. The Wehrmacht was in full retreat. The resistance networks, which had operated in the shadows for so long, emerged into the light. Pierre's bakery survived the liberation. It was not damaged significantly, though the neighborhood around it bore the scars of street fighting. When the Allies entered Paris, Pierre was briefly interviewed by American intelligence officers. The officers wanted to know about the resistance networks he had worked with, about the bakery's role in intelligence gathering, about the cipher system. Pierre was cooperative but careful. He provided general information. He confirmed the bakery's role, but he was deliberately vague about specifics. When asked about the cipher system, he claimed that he had never fully understood it, that the mathematicians and cryptographers had handled those details. When asked to identify other operatives, he said he remembered few names. The compartmentalization was so successful that he genuinely did not know most of them. The American officers, comparing notes with what they knew from other sources and from German intelligence files that were beginning to be available, pieced together a partial picture. But the picture was incomplete. Key pieces of information were missing. The full scope of the network was never documented.
and most of the operatives who had been involved continued to maintain their security discipline even after liberation. They did not immediately reveal their identities or their roles.
In the decades after the war, Pierre Laurent became a minor celebrity in French resistance history. He gave occasional interviews. He participated in some public events commemorating the resistance. But he remained fundamentally private about his wartime service. When journalists or historians tried to interview him in detail about the bakery network, he would provide general information, but would resist being drawn into specifics. "History is less interesting than mystery," he said in one interview from the 1970s. "If I tell you everything, there is no mystery. Leave some questions unanswered. Let people think." What historians have been able to piece together from post-war sources, declassified documents, and interviews with other operatives is fragmentary, but nonetheless revealing. The bakery network transmitted intelligence continuously from October 1941 until August 1944. During that period, it provided information about German logistics, defensive positions, unit movements, and supply operations. It functioned as a distribution center for resistance communications. It served as a safe house for individuals in hiding. By conservative estimates, it contributed to the safety and survival of at least 60 individuals, some of them Jewish, some of them Allied agents, some of them French political prisoners. No one has ever developed a comprehensive casualty count for the network. No one knows definitively how many lives were saved by intelligence it transmitted, or how many Nazis it helped to kill indirectly. These are probabilistic calculations that historians can only estimate. But what is clear is that the network survived the full 4 years of Nazi occupation and emerged intact at liberation. This makes it, by the standards of resistance operations, extraordinarily successful. The cipher system itself, while destroyed physically, has been partially reconstructed by cryptography historians who have studied the few remaining documents and interviewed surviving operatives. What they have found is a system of considerable sophistication. The air pocket patterns, the scoring methods, the distribution patterns, all of it was designed according to principles that would not be formally articulated in cryptographic literature until decades later. Hélène Rousseau, working without formal training in cryptography, without access to any literature on the subject, most cryptographic work was classified during the war, had independently developed a system that incorporated principles that later mathematicians would recognize as essentially sound. This speaks to something important about intelligence and security in wartime. Desperate necessity drives innovation. When conventional methods are unavailable, when the stakes are sufficiently high, when survival depends on finding new solutions to old problems, humans are capable of remarkable ingenuity. The bakery network was not operating according to theoretical principles that had been proven in academic literature. It was operating according to principles that desperate people had discovered through trial and error, through understanding of human psychology, through mathematical intuition, and through willingness to accept extraordinary personal risk. The story of the bakery network also reveals something about the nature of security itself. Modern security relies heavily on technology. Encryption algorithms, security protocols, digital authentication. But Pierre's network was secure because of organizational structure and human discipline. It was secure because people understood that security was more important than convenience, that operational security was more important than efficiency. It was secure because people were willing to accept the discomfort of compartmentalization, the uncertainty of not knowing whether their work was ultimately valuable, the risk that they might be captured and executed. In the decades since the war, security theorists have repeatedly observed
that the most sophisticated security systems fail when subjected to human frailty. People break under torture. People reveal information for reward or out of guilt. People make mistakes. The bakery network survived despite these human vulnerabilities because it had been designed specifically to account for them. It assumed that any individual might be captured and compromised. It structured itself so that compromise of any individual would not collapse the entire system. This principle is so important that it has become embedded in modern security practice. What is called need-to-know compartmentalization is now a standard principle in intelligence agencies worldwide. No individual knows more than they require to know to perform their function. If an individual is compromised, the damage is limited to their specific area of knowledge. The principle originated in wartime resistance networks. It was perfected through organizations like the bakery network, and it has become one of the foundational concepts of modern intelligence operations.
By war's end, the basic facts were clear, even if the details remained murky. The bakery network had functioned successfully for nearly 3 years. It had survived German counterintelligence operations. It had transmitted intelligence that, while impossible to quantify precisely, had contributed to Allied knowledge of German operations in occupied France. It had provided shelter and security for individuals fleeing persecution. Most remarkably, it had survived with minimal casualties and no successful breaches of security. The Germans never fully understood what had been operating in their midst. They captured fragments of information. They suspected a network, but they never grasped the full architecture. They never appreciated how sophisticated the system was. And by the time they might have developed a deeper understanding, it was too late. The Allies were in France. The occupation was ending. The elaborate apparatus of German security was collapsing into chaos. Major Klaus Hoffmann, the Gestapo officer who had been tasked with dismantling resistance networks in Paris, survived the war and was captured by the Allies in 1945. In a series of post-war interrogations, he was questioned about resistance operations in Paris. When shown information about the bakery network, he appeared confused and somewhat incredulous. He insisted that such an operation, if it had truly been as effective as intelligence analysts suggested, would have been considered a major security threat and would have received proportionally greater resources to counter it. His response is telling. It reveals the fundamental intelligence failure that allowed the bakery network to survive. Hoffmann and the German intelligence apparatus simply did not recognize the threat for what it was. They did not perceive the bakery as a significant node in a communications network. They did not understand the sophistication of the system because they could not conceive that such sophistication could exist in so unlikely a medium. They failed not because they were incompetent, but because the bakery network was operating outside the framework of what they believed to be possible. This is one of the critical lessons of intelligence history. Intelligence failures are often not due to lack of capability on the part of the investigating authority, but rather due to fundamental misunderstanding of what is being investigated. The most successful deceptions are often those that operate according to principles that the adversary has not conceived of as possible. Pierre Laurent lived until 1989, dying at the age of 75. His bakery continued to operate in Paris after the war, though eventually he sold it and it passed into other hands. The building still stands today, though it is no longer a bakery. It is a small shop of some kind, unremarkable in every way. If you were walking down the Rue de Rivoli, you would pass it without knowing that from 1941 to 1944, that building was the nexus of one of the most sophisticated resistance networks in occupied Europe.
You would not know that bread baked in those ovens carried intelligence that influenced strategic decisions. You would not know that dozens of lives were saved because someone figured out how to hide secrets in bread. Hélène Rousseau lived until 1987. After the war, she returned to academic mathematics. She never married. She never published a book or a major paper about her wartime work. She remained quiet and reserved, living what appeared to be a relatively ordinary life. But those who knew her, who understood what she had accomplished, recognized her as one of the most brilliant cryptographers of the Second World War, working independently and in secret to develop a system that incorporated principles of information security that would not be formally articulated in academic literature for decades. Michel Durand survived the war and went on to a career in French intelligence. He lived until 1992 and never wrote a comprehensive account of the bakery network or his role in organizing it. He died having kept most of the network's secrets. This was consistent with his operational discipline. Even after the war, even when the secret keeping was no longer necessary, he maintained his compartmentalization. He did not fully reveal what he knew. He did not completely document the system. He protected the privacy and security of operatives even after they no longer needed protection. The story of the bakery network does not end with liberation or with the deaths of its key operatives. It continues to matter because it taught something essential about security, about innovation, and about human capacity for ingenuity under duress. The principles that Hélène Rousseau developed intuitively are the principles that modern cryptography is built upon. The compartmentalization that Michel Durand implemented is the compartmentalization that modern intelligence agencies use. The understanding that security requires sacrifice and discipline is a lesson that remains relevant to every generation. What is most remarkable about the bakery network is how ordinary it was. It did not involve elaborate equipment or sophisticated technology. It did not require massive resources or military force. It operated using something as mundane and unthreatening as bread, and yet it functioned as effectively as more elaborate systems with far greater resources. This teaches a fundamental principle of security and of intelligence. Efficiency is often inversely related to conspicuousness. The more conspicuous a system, the more resources it requires. The less conspicuous, the fewer resources it needs, and paradoxically, the more effective it becomes. The Gestapo's failure to appreciate the bakery network also teaches us something about the limits of power. The Gestapo was powerful, it was ruthless, it was efficient by the standards of the time, but power focused on the obvious inevitably misses the subtle. A security apparatus designed to detect tanks and artillery will not detect bread. This is a limitation not of competence, but of conceptual framework. Every security system, no matter how sophisticated, is bounded by what it conceives to be possible. This principle remains relevant in the modern era. Modern security systems are designed to detect certain kinds of threats. Cybersecurity systems are designed to detect digital intrusions. Border security systems are designed to detect smuggling of physical goods. But what about threats that operate outside these frameworks? What about communication systems that do not use electronic media? What about information transfer mechanisms that look like ordinary commercial activity? The bakery network teaches us that the most effective threats and the most effective security measures are often those that operate outside the framework of expected behavior. There is a human dimension to this story that deserves attention. The bakery network succeeded because people were willing to accept extraordinary personal risk for abstract principles. Pierre Laurent did not know whether his actions would ultimately matter. He had no certainty that the intelligence transmitted through his bakery would save lives or contribute to Allied victory. He acted anyway, risking torture and execution because he believed that resistance was necessary. This is not a calculation that can be made in advance. It is an act of faith combined with moral commitment. Similarly, Hélène Rousseau was willing to accept the certainty of death if captured, having arranged for her own swift execution rather than allowing herself to be interrogated. This is an extraordinary commitment to security principle. She was willing to die to prevent betrayal of her comrades. In the end, it was not necessary. She was not captured, but her willingness to make that sacrifice shaped her work. It made her meticulous. It made her careful. It made her understand the implications of every decision she made regarding the network structure and security. These are not abstract virtues. These are real commitments by real people, and they had real consequences. The bakery network survived, in significant part because the people operating it understood that security was not an optional luxury. It was a necessity. It was the difference between survival and death, not just for themselves, but for dozens of others who depended on the network's security.
The P-47 Thunderbolt and the bakery network represent two different American contributions to the defeat of Nazi Germany. One was built on massive industrial capacity. One was built on organizational discipline and human ingenuity. One was obvious and powerful. One was subtle and barely visible. Yet both were essential. The Thunderbolt destroyed the Luftwaffe and provided air superiority. The bakery network provided the information and coordination that made that superiority meaningful. Neither could have succeeded without the other. In the end, the story of the bakery network is the story of how ordinary people do extraordinary things when they are forced to by circumstances beyond their control. It is the story of a baker who became a spy, a mathematician who became a cryptographer, an intelligence officer who became a network coordinator. None of them had chosen these roles in advance. None of them had trained for them in any formal sense. They had been shaped by history and had responded by developing capabilities that even in retrospect seem remarkable. The bakery that Pierre Laurent ran is gone now. The cipher tables that Hélène Rousseau designed have been burned and reconstructed only partially. The network that Michel Duran organized has been dismantled and studied only incompletely. But the principles that they developed remain relevant. They remain relevant because they are rooted in fundamental truths about security, about information, about human nature, and about the relationship between power and invisibility. If you were to walk down the Rue de Rivoli in Paris today, you would not see anything remarkable. The city has been rebuilt. The occupation is 80 years in the past. The people who lived through that time are almost all gone. But if you knew where to look, if you understood the history, you might see it differently. You might see in the ordinary commerce of the city, in the bread still baked and sold by bakers throughout Paris, in the communications networks that move information through the city, the echoes of that time when bread carried secrets and bakers carried the weight of nations. The Thunderbolt pilots spoke of the distinctive sound of their aircraft's machine guns. They called it the sound of American power. The bakery network had its own sound, though it was barely audible. It was the sound of the oven, the sound of flour being worked into dough, the sound of bread being scored,
the sound of daily commerce and ordinary life. It was the sound of resistance operating in plain sight, hidden not by silence, but by the noise of normality around it. That sound has been silent for 80 years, but the lessons it taught remain loud and clear for anyone willing to listen. In the mathematics of compartmentalization, in the understanding that security requires sacrifice, in the recognition that the most powerful tools are often the most ordinary ones, wielded by people who understand that ordinary is not weakness, but strength. The bread has all been eaten long ago. The ovens that baked it have been dismantled or replaced, but the legacy of the bakery network, like the legacy of the Thunderbolt, survives. It survives in the principles of modern security. It survives in the stories told about the Second World War. It survives in the understanding that victory belongs not just to the powerful, but to those who understand that power takes many forms, and that sometimes the greatest power lies in the things that nobody thinks to look for. This is the story of a bakery that became a spy hub. This is the story of how bread became a weapon. This is the story of how ordinary people did extraordinary things, and how those things, though buried in history, continue to matter to this day.